So we're talking about mastering the mental game, practice mind versus competition mind. And so, coming from a high school perspective and a club perspective, there are a lot of different things that we need to look at. And so, when we're coaching in the high school realm, we don't have a lot of time to focus separately on these, and we need to have a quick turnover in a small amount of time. Club level, we've got more time to work on skill development and things like that. So I will try to address both, and then we'll work from there. So how many of you have been focusing on working on the mental game with your athletes? Just let me know in the comments. The first thing that we want to look at is the practice mind and the training mindset, which is also known as the training mindset. And so what you want to see in your athletes and what they're generally going to be doing is using this mindset for practice. It's good for practice. It's good because they work on cognitive control of movements. Their mind is active. They have inquisitive thinking, and they're evaluating a lot. So during the course of skill development, they're learning all these things. Their brain is working this way. They're a little more judgmental on how they're doing the skill or how not to do the skill, and they're pretty critical of self. They'll also try to force to make it happen, to make that skill acquisition happen, to learn the new skill. They're a lot of times impatient. You'll find your athletes that are perfectionists. Some of these things, being impatient and self-criticism, is actually a barrier, as some of you probably know, to the competition mind, because they're not able to shift from practice to competition, but we'll get into that a little bit more in depth. So during the practice mind, they're also going to be working on technique. Their mind wants to look good, especially at the high school level. There's a lot of social approval that the athletes want. So that also plays into consideration when they're transferring from their practice to competition. They want social approval. They want approval of the coaches. They don't want to look bad. That's a lot of pressure. So they are working hard during practice so that they get that social approval when they go into competition. And so that's another area that we need to work on with our athletes, that if we don't catch that, that could be a detriment to their performance, not even knowing either, because a lot of times, teenagers don't really tell us. So we want open communication with our athletes, but it doesn't always happen. So we need to really foster that and build that so that trust can come into play during skill development, which will transfer over to competition. The practice mind also wants to strive for expectations. So they expect if they do A, B will happen. And that is something very specific that we don't want them focusing on expectations or outcomes in practice, because that's how then they are no longer in the competition mind. They're still using their practice mind instead of shifting over, which that also causes a lot of challenges for athletes. So there's a multitude of things that we can work on. If I'm working with your teams, then I focus on developing a plan for each specific team to work on. And coaches, your team, so how they're interacting, how they're not interacting. And it just depends on the sport too, and we can get into that a little bit more later. But you also see the practice mind is purposely focusing on improvement for the future. And that's where we want them to be. We want our athletes to be focusing on, okay, I am working hard in practice so that I can have XYZ happen. We don't want that to happen when they're competing, because now they're no longer in the game. They're not able to get in the zone, but they're focusing on, I have to do really great today because, this recruiter's not going to see me. My coach is going to be upset. My parents are going to be upset. I don't want to look silly in front of my teammates. So we have to work on that focus too. And then, of course, they're relying on mechanics to get the skills done when they're in the practice mind. So with all of this being said, it's important that we're focusing on understanding this, the stages of learning for our athletes. And so When we're in the high school arena, so I'm the head coach for a gymnastics team, both in school and club. And so we have to focus on understanding what our athletes are going through. And I'm sure a lot of you understand this as well. And it takes a lot of time to work with our athletes on this. So you really need to focus on setting aside a time to work with your athletes on the mental game. You can work on the mental game during practice and competition. I'll tell you how a little bit later, but it's very specific and deliberate. So understanding when I'll use gymnastics as an example. So summertime, after they finish state championships, we go into recovery and skill development. And so they're at the beginning stages of learning. So they're learning what the skill is, they're learning how to work through it. You know, they're messing up, they're trying this time, they're trying next time, and they really don't have it at all. You'll see that you're perfectionist, and you want to keep an eye out on this, that your perfectionists want to learn the skill yesterday. So you give them a new skill, or say you're fielding, you have new call signs, whatever it is, your athlete wants to get it the first time. And that's great. Of course, we would love our athletes to get things on the first try, but it's not realistic and it's not beneficial for the future of your athlete, because then it starts taking away from their ability to learn because they're so worried about trying to be perfect. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. So once they're in the beginning stages, they're learning this skill acquisition, then they're shifting over into the intermediate stage of learning. And so this is where they're starting to feel what they're doing more. And that's a big thing I like to focus on with my athletes, is that they're feeling what they're doing. So it's not enough to say that, okay, you got to just swing the right way and put your head in there. You know, I'm sure coaches don't do that. Sometimes they might, I don't know. But we have to help them connect cognitively to what they're doing. So if you're wanting them to perform a task, we want them to feel it. And so you're practicing that so that they can transfer that to the competition. So, you know, let's use golf, for example. You know, they don't have enough time from start to finish of the swing to focus on, okay, I need to do this. I need to put my head in. I need to shift. I need to turn. Whatever it is that you're telling, they don't have time. It becomes automatic, and that's what we want them to do. So during the intermediate phase of learning, they're starting to develop this. They're starting to get this, you know, muscle memory, as we call it, but it's cognitive memory, and they're working on developing that. And then the next stage they go through is expert. And that's when they're doing the skill, they're understanding how it feels, they're understanding why they're doing it and when. And now it's becoming a part of them. So it's no longer them trying to just do the skill and learn it. Now they've gone through all these stages, and then they're an expert because they can start doing it. And of course, it's with lots and lots of repetition. That's why we practice. And so it's also important to understand what our athletes, what is their type of learning style, you know. And it's hard, and it's a lot of extra work for coaches to spend on that, but I think it's incredibly important, because you can cultivate an amazing team when you also know how your athletes work. And so that's a lot of what I focus on too with my teams, and with coaches as well, as trying to understand, like, how do we bring all of this together, and how do we get the best performance out of our athletes and our teams so that we can reach that level that we all aspire to. And so we really focus on learning that. The next is the automatic subconscious execution of the skill. So now they're no longer thinking of it. They're just doing it. And so, you know, they're in the zone, and they've learned how to do that in practice. And that's something that we need to focus on too. So let's say we're doing a scrimmage, right? And so that is where we're starting to implement the practice mind into the competition mind, because we're simulating what we want to have happen during that competition. It's not always easy to do that, but is 100% something that we should focus on as coaches with your athletes, because if you have a practice environment where X, Y, and Z is happening, and then you go to a competition environment and none of that is happening, what do? You can't prepare for everything that's going to happen in a competition, but you can prepare them by feeling that pressure that they would feel in a competition. And so that's a whole kind of development piece that we need to do with the athletes, and that is something that you can certainly work on with your athletes as well. So this is the practice mind. The next is the competition mind and the trusting mindset. And so how we want to see our athletes in the competition mind is having the automatic execution of motor skills. And so that's where they're just knowing how to read what they're doing. I guess we'll use baseball hitting, for example. That automatic execution, they know how to read the ball, they know when to swing, and they're automatically going to do that because they've been practicing so much that that's ingrained in them. And then they're able to make contact. But if they haven't practiced enough, then that is where it's going to kind of unravel a little bit too. But it could also be because of social pressure and outside pressure. And that's a big thing that we can focus on with our athletes again. The competition mind has a passive mind because it has become a trusting mind. And so they're not thinking of, oh my gosh, I have to do this. It's like all this extra noise. And how many of you have athletes that are just amazing? Like they're your top kids in practice. And you're like, this is going to be awesome. Like we're going to crush it. I'm so psyched about this. But they don't have a passive mind during competition. They have an active mind because they're thinking of all the things that they need to put together from their practice to transfer over to the competition. So it's really important that we get them in the passive mind. And so you can have the greatest practice athlete in the world, but they haven't yet developed their competition mind and by having a trusting mindset. Their mind is quiet. They're free of trying. They're just doing. So they're not trying to win the game. And there's a difference between, when I say trying, I'm not talking about being lazy or not trying to do their performance, but they're more free. They're in their zone because they're automatically doing and responding the way that they need to because they're in that mindset. They're not judgmental of their performance. They're just doing it and they're going with the flow because they have all the skill development. They have the cognitive motor learning. They have everything that's in place and they're easy to transfer that because they've practiced it. They're accepting what happens with their game, their competition, and they move on. So they have, one part of the game happens, maybe they mess up, but they accept it and they move on and they're not attached to that. And that's something oftentimes it's hard to have athletes shift that. They're so upset because they didn't do X, Y, Z. Coach might be upset because they didn't do X, Y, and Z. And so that's kind of reaffirming that social acceptance that, oh my gosh, my coach is upset. I'm going to get benched. This is so upsetting. Like, and then they start messing up more and more. When they're in the trusting mindset, there's a couple things. They're trusting themselves and they're trusting you as a coach. And so having that bond with your athletes and changing that and teaching them during practice too. There's a difference between being a tough coach and not being a good coach, that you don't want to damage your athletes because you want them to compete as long as they can because you guys have a good relationship working together. So that acceptance piece again is they make a mistake, they move on, over and done with. They're just letting it happen in competition and they're waiting for it to happen. So they're not over anxious. So when they're waiting for it to happen, the piece where they get nervous and they're going too early for something, or they're missing the point, they're missing the mark, it's because that they are not waiting for it to happen. they're trying to make it happen. And so if you can see the difference between practice mind and competition mind, it kind of, we don't want it to shift back and forth because we want to develop it on this first practice to move over to competition. They have a lot of patience and they just play the game. And so just playing the game, they're free of all of this stress. It is hard to teach an athlete to do this, but I know that we can. I've been doing it with athletes for a long time in teams, and it's just something that we have to work on. But it can be done, and we can teach our athletes that. We can teach them in, over time, and we can develop a plan with our athletes that help them. They just get the job done. So they're doing what they need to do. They're performing because they've practiced and they're getting it done. And they're throwing away all those expectations, which I talked about before in the practice mind. They have expectations like, okay, I'm going to get this skill. I'm going to get this play because I want this to happen in the future. I want to be a part of a state championship team. I want to have a college recruiter look at me. All those things are tied to it. But when they're in the trusting mindset, competition mind, they throw away those expectations because they're just doing. They're in the present orientation and they're playing now. So again, if you compare the two, when you're looking at the practice mindset, they're not, that present orientation is not play for now. It's like, I'm playing for the future. So if you can see the difference. And then they're relying on instincts when they're in competition mind, because those instincts are the motor skills that they've developed during practice. And that's something that it takes a lot of time, a lot of numbers, and a lot of repetition. So during practice, that's something that we need to focus on. So if we haven't practiced with our athletes a lot, but we just taught them, let's say, a new play or a new routine, a new way to hit something, we've had like a couple practices, you can't expect your athletes to get it right the first time. It is nice, but that's not always going to happen, and that's okay. And we have to reinforce that with our athletes so that we can teach them how to rely on their instincts and what they know during competition. Okay, so the strategies for helping develop this trusting mindset and competition mind are, there's a bunch of things that we can do with our athletes. This is a lot of what I do with athletes. We have to have a game plan and have a strategy. So we have a pre-competition playbook that we do. So it's a mindset. So let's say I'll have one of my athletes, and what's their game strategy? They're going to go out, they're going to execute what they need to do. They're going to show confidence, and maybe they have a word set or a visualization to take with them as part of their pregame. They're going to commit to a plan for each play, shot, or routine. And so that's part of the plan that I'm talking about, that when they go into the competition, they're prepared and ready because they have a pregame. So how many of you guys remember little softball players when they're younger? I think we do it in high school too, that they have their walk-up song. They're all pumped up because they have that music when they're going up to bat. So it's kind of like that, but it's a little bit more in depth, where we're, helping our athletes create a plan. And like I said, it's a lot of extra work to do that, because not every athlete is going to resonate with the one thing that you're saying. Like, okay, we're going to go out and do X, Y, Z. And that's great. That is your base of how you want to run your program. That's the base of how you want to train your athletes. But spending a little time, if you do one-on-ones with your athletes, there may be something else that you can implement into that strategy, which is a keyword or a code word for your athletes, so that they're like, okay, I'm getting in my mindset here. And that's something that you develop and plan. When they're going into the competition mindset, I want them to be decisive, so that they know what they're doing and they know what their role is during the competition, what skills that they're going to be using, This is all pregame. We don't want them doing in the game, but this is all pregame and getting them ready. So we want them to be decisive, which being decisive is being confident. And that's a whole nother topic that I talk about too, confidence versus self-esteem. And they're two different things. And the confidence is having the confidence in their skill set. The self-esteem is their person, what they think or see of themselves. That's something also to address. I think overall for teams, that's something I dig into with athletes too. You don't have a lot of time to do that, but I think it's good to help them understand the definition of that, because your athletes that are wanting to excel and be there, they're going to think about those things. And that's something that you can kind of talk about to them as well. So again, being confident, understanding. And then the last thing that in the trusting mindset for competition is they're going to play and feel by instinct, right? Because we've practiced it. They know, let's say for gymnastics, they are doing a leap on beam. They have to push through their feet, they stretch, and they have to pull their legs closed in order to come back to the beam. So they're now playing by instinct and feel, because they know how it feels. And so the first time I've started talking to athletes, because I'll go to the athletes game, if the athletes are my clients, I try to go to their competitions as much as I can, but I want them in practice to feel what they're doing, and they can absolutely feel what they're doing if we teach them how to do that. So, there's a lot of things that we can work on, and understanding the competition mindset and the practice mindset. And so there are a lot of things that I can talk about too. There's a lot more that we've been working on. Let me go back to this slide too. So let me tell you, as coaches, what can you do to have your athletes improve trust, right? So like I said before, you can define what trust and confidence are. You can help them understand what that is. I have some notes here because I don't want to forget anything, and there's so much that I have to share. But you can reach out to me after this webinar as well for any additional questions. I'm happy to answer questions and help brainstorm with you. But helping your athletes build that trusting mindset, again, is help them define trust and confidence. What is that? What are the definition, and what is it to them? That we can spend a few minutes on that. We can spend a separate day of practice and just work on that. You're just going to have your team together. You're creating the playbook. You're helping them create their playbook in addition to your playbook, but they also have to have their own to go into competition. And you can start to identify where they have those trust breakdowns. It might be that they aren't trusting what they're doing. They're not trusting their level of skill acquisition. They're not understanding how they did it. They just did it. You don't want that. And you have a lot of naturally talented athletes that do that. They just kind of do it because they have a lot of body awareness. They have just natural athletic ability. But when it starts getting harder for them, they no longer know how to just feel and trust, because they didn't learn how to do that in the early stages. So that's one big thing with your, naturally talented athletes. You have to really get in there and teach them how to feel and know and break down, identifying where that trust kind of falls off. And then you want to enhance their trusting skills. So there's a lot of core issues that you can address. I would do one at a time. And then whatever that issue is, you're figuring out, well, how can we integrate a trust response to that, and you do that during practice, warm up, and play, right? And so that's, again, skill acquisition. We're learning how to practice. We're learning how to do a scrimmage and work with our athletes. And then we have our pregame plan. And then changing practice routines if necessary too. And then you want to track those trusting skills. So I know after competition, we're analyzing. I know I do as a coach. I go back and watch the videos of my athletes, and I see what they did right and what they need to improve on. When I address it with athletes, I try not to say, well, you did this wrong, which that's great. That doesn't help them. But what helps them more is saying, okay, this is what you did well. This is what we can improve on. And then you have a conversation with them. What do you think you can do to improve it? That's going to give a lot of answers for you. And that's going to help you also understand, like, they totally missed what you said in practice. They didn't get it. And then you go back and you work on that. And so teaching your athletes also how to use self-monitoring tools and teaching them, like, okay, they can go back and watch the video, but they can, once they get to that expert phase of learning, then they're going to know when their swing is off, or their jumps are off, their tumbling's off. They're going to know when they're not reading the court the right way, or their swing. They're going to know how to do that. And then they can talk to you and you can have that conversation. And so those are just a few things that you can do. There's a multitude of things that we can do to help our athletes for practice mind and competition mind. And I'm really happy to talk to you about that after this. And I'm ready to take some questions. And I hope this has helped. It's such a big thing for me as a coach, and both with athletes and with my high performance athletes that I'm coaching. But it's so incredibly important. We can do so much good for our kids when we teach them and we partner together with them to make this happen. It's a lot of hard work, and all you coaches are amazing. So I'm really happy to be here, and thank you so much for joining me.